Dare lived a life that many admired but few understood. His days were spent in reckless abandon, partying late into the night, indulging in his vices and building his empire of wealth and influence. He scoffed at the idea of God and mocked those who believed in him. Church, he thought it was for weaklings who needed a crutch. He openly laughed at pastors and priests, calling them frauds no better than con men. His friends, even those who cared for him, would sometimes try to convince him to join them at church, but Dare would just smirk, shaking his head. Why would I go to church? To listen to some man talk nonsense about a God who doesn't exist? I'd rather spend my Sunday at the beach with a drink in my hand, he'd often say, brushing off their pleas. His words were sharp, and his disregard for faith was so deep that it seemed like nothing could ever shake his convictions. One Friday night, after a long week of work and play, Dare found himself at another lavish party. The music was loud, the alcohol flowed freely, and the people around him were caught in the same reckless cycle. In the middle of the revelry, Dare mocked a conversation about faith. A friend, Tolu, tried again, urging him to reconsider his views. Dare, don't you see? Life is more than this. There's a higher power guiding us. You need to believe, Tolu said earnestly. Dare laughed loudly. Believe? There's no such thing. You're just afraid of the truth. Religion is a business, Tolu. And I'm not buying it. The group around him laughed, but Tolu's expression grew serious. He was done trying. But Dare didn't care. He lived for the present moment, for the thrill, and for proving to everyone that he was untouchable, immune to the consequences of his actions. That night, after the party ended, Dare stumbled home, too drunk to think clearly. He collapsed into his bed and fell into a deep, uneasy sleep. But in his dreams, things weren't right. He found himself standing in a vast, endless void, staring at a brilliant light. It wasn't a light from the sun. It was alive, breathing, almost sentient. A voice called out from the darkness, Dare, Dare, do you not hear me? The voice was neither harsh nor kind, but it echoed in his very soul. Dare tried to scream, but no sound came. He couldn't move. The light moved closer, and with it the overwhelming sense of presence. Dare awoke with a jolt, his heart racing, drenched in sweat. He tried to dismiss it as just a strange dream, but something inside him felt different. He brushed it off. Maybe it was the alcohol. The following week, Dare's life began to feel off. Things weren't going according to plan. Business deals that once flowed effortlessly were now collapsing, one after the other. Clients started pulling out. His investments faltered. He shrugged it off as bad luck, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Then on a quiet evening he received an anonymous message. The time has come, Dare. You will see the truth soon. He didn't know what to make of it. Who could be playing games with him? But the message felt too real to ignore. One day, Dare decided to take a break from his chaotic life and visit an old friend, Kemi, who had been trying to reach him for years. She had always been the spiritual one, and Dare had ridiculed her endlessly for it. But now he felt desperate, as if something was closing in on him. When he arrived at her apartment, she welcomed him with a smile, but there was a strange calmness about her. Kemi, something's wrong. I don't know what it is, but I feel hunted. I keep having these weird dreams and my life is falling apart, he confessed. Kemi listened patiently, then quietly said, maybe it's time to face what you've been running from, Dare. You can't keep ignoring the truth forever. Before Dare could respond, the lights flickered and the room grew cold. He shivered but tried to act tough. This isn't funny, Kemi. I'm not in the mood for this nonsense. But she wasn't laughing. She simply stood, her face serious. You need to prepare. You're about to face something beyond your understanding. That night, Dare's world was shattered. As he walked home, the streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of the city absent. The air was thick, as though charged with something unnatural. Suddenly, a bright light appeared in the distance, coming toward him at an impossible speed. It was like nothing he had ever seen. As the light grew closer, Dare's heart pounded in his chest. His body froze in fear. He tried to turn and run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed by the overwhelming force of what was coming. The light stopped right in front of him, and from it emerged a towering figure, radiant and powerful, but with eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. Dare, the voice boomed. You have mocked me for too long. Now you will see the truth you have denied. Dare's knees buckled, and for the first time in his life he felt small, insignificant. The ground beneath Dare's feet seemed to crack open, and the world around him warped, as if reality itself was bending and collapsing. He could hear the sound of distant voices crying out in pain and see flashes of past decisions. The people he had hurt, the lives he had ruined with his cruel words and actions. God's voice echoed through the void. "These are the consequences of your choices, Dare. Every action, every word you spoke rippled through time, and now you see the damage it has caused." Dare tried to speak, but no words came. His chest tightened with fear. Was this the end? Had his life truly been nothing more than a string of reckless mistakes? He fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of it all. The weight of his sins pressed down on him like an anchor. "I never believed," Dare whispered to himself, more out of disbelief than repentance. "I never believed this was real." Suddenly, the void shifted, and Dare found himself standing in the middle of a desolate city. Buildings crumbled around him, and the sky was dark with thick clouds. The streets were empty, save for the few souls wandering aimlessly, their faces hollow with despair. God appeared before him again, the radiant light now dimmed, revealing a face full of sorrow. "This is the world you are leaving behind, Dare. A world built on arrogance, pride, and the denial of truth." Dare looked around, unable to process what he was seeing. The destruction was his doing, he realized. Everything he had ever mocked, everything he had rejected had led to this moment. He had taken the world for granted, believing that his success would shield him from the consequences of his choices. "You wanted proof," God's voice rumbled. "Here it is. Will you continue to deny the truth, or will you choose to change?" The world around Dare shifted once again, this time pulling him into a place of deep, suffocating darkness. He felt alone, isolated, as though he was trapped in a void with no escape. The fear that gripped him was unlike anything he had ever felt before. His once confident demeanor was gone, replaced with a crippling sense of vulnerability. God's presence was still there, yet the light was gone. It felt as if all the hope in the universe had been extinguished. Dare finally spoke, his voice trembling with uncertainty. What do you want from me?" he asked, barely able to get the words out. A deep, almost sorrowful silence followed before God replied, "I want you to see, to understand, to make a choice. You cannot undo the past, Dare, but you can shape the future." Dare's mind spun. This wasn't just about his past, it was about his future. Could he really turn his back on everything he had believed, everything he had known, to embrace something so unknown, so mysterious? With a deep breath, Dare spoke, his voice trembling but resolute. I believe. I see now. I was wrong. Please forgive me." As the words left his lips, the darkness around him began to fade, replaced by a warm, comforting light. He was no longer alone. God had forgiven him. Dare awoke with a start back in his apartment. The storm outside had passed, and the world seemed quieter. The weight that had been pressing down on him was gone. He looked around, half expecting the divine figure to appear again, but there was nothing. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? But no. Something deep within him had shifted. Dare felt the presence of God in a way he never had before. He didn't need proof anymore. He didn't need signs or miracles. He knew. As Dare stood up and looked out the window, he felt a new sense of peace wash over him. The world outside was still the same, but he wasn't the same. He had made the choice to believe, and that belief was the first step toward redemption. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He would have to face the consequences of his past, make amends, and rebuild his life. But for the first time he felt hope. True hope. Over the months that followed, Dare's life slowly began to change. He found himself reading scriptures, seeking out guidance, and connecting with people who shared his faith. He felt a deep, unshakable peace that he had never known before, a sense of purpose that was far greater than any wealth or success he had once sought. But he never forgot what he had seen, the destruction, the lives he had hurt, and the choice that had saved him. And every day he worked to make things right. One evening, Dare stood before a group of people who were lost, much like he had been. He spoke to them with conviction, sharing his story, his transformation, from the blasphemous man he had once been to the believer he was now. The crowd listened, captivated by his words. Many had doubts, but Dare's testimony was a powerful reminder of the mercy and grace that awaited anyone willing to believe. Just as Dare's life seemed to be falling into place, he faced another trial. A business deal that had once seemed promising began to crumble, threatening everything he had worked for. The temptation to revert to his old ways, to give in to greed and arrogance, was overwhelming. But this time, Dare held firm. He turned to God, praying for guidance and strength. And in the end the deal fell apart, but it was the best thing that could have happened. Dare realized that faith was not just about belief. It was about trusting in the journey no matter how difficult. Years later, Dare stood in front of a group of young people, teaching them about the power of faith, the importance of humility, and the choice that had changed his life. He had become a leader not in wealth or status but in wisdom and faith. His journey had been long, but it had brought him closer to the truth. "It's never too late to change," Dare said, smiling as he looked at the young faces in front of him. "No matter how far you've gone, there's always a way back. Believe." And with that, Dare knew his story was just beginning. In the years that followed, Dare continued to evolve. His transformation was no longer just an internal one. It began to reflect outwardly in the way he interacted with the world. He became a mentor, guiding others who were lost in the same way he once had been. But every day was a struggle, and Dare knew it. He was still haunted by the mistakes of his past, the words he had once spoken, the lives he had destroyed. He sought redemption in every action, every apology, and every attempt to make right what he had wronged. One day, Dare received a letter. It was from an old friend, someone he had not spoken to in years. A friend he had abandoned just as he had abandoned his faith. The letter was short, but it was a message Dare never thought he would receive. Read, "Dare, I've seen the change in you. I've heard your story. I just wanted to say I forgive you. We all make mistakes, but what matters is what we do after. You're on the right path now, and I'm proud of you." Reading the letter, Dare felt tears welling in his eyes. It wasn't the forgiveness he had hoped for, but it was the kind he needed. It reminded him that no matter how much damage had been done, it was never too late to change. He held on to that letter for weeks, often reading it when the doubt and guilt crept in. It was a sign that people could change, that there was always hope even for someone like him. But Dare's path wasn't smooth. His old life, the one he had left behind, would sometimes call to him in the quietest moments, whispering that he could go back to the life of excess, that he could regain everything he had once enjoyed without the weight of faith. He had been successful without God after all. He had been powerful, respected. But now, as he stood before others, teaching them about the grace he had found, the old temptations loomed large. The turning point came when Dare found himself standing at a crossroads, both literally and figuratively. He was on a business trip, sitting in a luxury hotel room staring out at the city lights. It was a moment that could have been perfect for him to slip back into his old ways. The city buzzed with temptation, with parties and the kind of life he had once thrived in. But then his phone buzzed. It was an email from Kemi. She had sent him a simple prayer, just a few words. "God, guide Dare. Lead him on the path to righteousness. Keep him strong in his faith." Those words, those simple words, pierced him. It was in that moment that Dare realized what he had been fighting for all these years. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't power. It was peace, redemption, and a life aligned with his faith. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and prayed. "God, I don't want to go back to who I was. I want to be someone better. Please help me." The journey was far from over, but Dare knew that every step, no matter how small, was part of his transformation. He couldn't undo the past, but he could change the future. As Dare returned home from his trip, he realized that the temptation no longer had the hold over him it once did. His past would always be a part of him, but he no longer let it define him. He was free to make better choices, free to live with purpose. Dare continued to speak at church gatherings, schools, and community centers, telling anyone who would listen about the incredible journey he had been on. He became an advocate for the lost, the broken, and the ones who had given up. "I was once lost," he would say to crowds of young people, "but I found my way. And you can too." With each story, each life touched, Dare felt more fulfilled than he ever had before. No longer did he measure his worth by the money he made or the people who admired him. His worth was found in his faith, in his ability to help others, and in the peace he had finally found. And then one quiet evening, as Dare sat alone in his office, reflecting on all that had transpired, he heard a soft knock at the door. When he opened it, there stood Tulu, the same friend who had once tried to convince him of the truth all those years ago. "I knew you would come around, Dare," Tulu said, a smile tugging at his lips. Dare smiled back, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. "It took me a while, but I see it now. I see the truth. I see God. And I'll never turn away again." And in that moment, Dare knew that his life had come full circle. From a man who mocked faith and blasphemed God to a man who now stood in the light of grace and redemption, Dare had found his true purpose. It was not about being perfect. It was about choosing to believe even in the darkest moments, and knowing that no matter how far someone had fallen, there was always a way back. The journey was not over, but Dare knew that with faith, every step would lead him to a better tomorrow.